There's a particular kind of silence spreading across America in 2026. It's not the peaceful kind, the quiet of a Sunday morning or a small town at dusk. This is a different silence. It's the silence of uncertainty. The silence after a layoff email hits an inbox at 6:12 a.m. The silence inside a car where someone is calculating how many nights they can sleep there before it becomes permanent. The silence of a society that senses something is breaking but hasn't fully decided how to talk about it yet. On the surface, the numbers don't always look catastrophic. GDP still grows. Markets still fluctuate within acceptable narratives. Headlines still alternate between optimism and caution. But beneath that polished layer, something more fragile is unfolding. Something harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore once you see it. This isn't a sudden collapse. It's a slow, unraveling. Layoffs, for instance, are no longer shocking events. They've become ambient part of the background noise of modern employment. Entire sectors, especially in tech and white-collar industries, are undergoing what companies call strategic restructuring. But for workers, the language feels detached from reality. These are not just adjustments, they are disruptions of identity, routine, and security. Careers that once promised stability now feel provisional, almost temporary by design. And what makes this moment uniquely unsettling is the mismatch between expectations and reality. For decades, Americans were told a consistent story. Get educated, work hard, stay adaptable, and you will be secure. But in 2026, that promise feels increasingly conditional. People who followed every rule are discovering that the system itself has changed. At the same time, debt has quietly become the invisible architecture shaping daily life. It's not just student loans anymore. It's credit cards used to cover groceries. It's auto loans stretched across longer terms. It's buy now, pay later, plans that fragment consumption into manageable but relentless pieces. Debt is no longer an emergency tool. It's a survival mechanism. And survival, when financed, comes with a cost that compounds not just financially but psychologically. There's a growing sense that many Americans are living in a state of suspended stability. They are not in crisis today, but they are one unexpected event away from it. One medical bill, one rent increase, one job loss. The margin for error has narrowed so dramatically that ordinary life begins to feel like a balancing act. Meanwhile, in cities across the country, another reality is becoming harder to ignore. Visible homelessness is expanding, not just in scale, but in permanence. What was once framed as a temporary or localized issue now appears systemic. Encampments are no longer anomalies, they are features of the urban landscape, and their presence challenges the narrative that prosperity is broadly shared. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this moment is not any single issue, it's the convergence of all of them. Layoffs erode income stability. Debt absorbs financial shocks but deepens long-term vulnerability. Housing costs push more people to the edge. And when these forces intersect, they create a feedback loop that is difficult to escape. This is how systems strain not through one dramatic failure, but through the accumulation of pressures that, over time, become unsustainable. And yet, the conversation around these issues often remains fragmented. Layoffs are discussed as business cycles. Debt is framed as personal responsibility. Homelessness is treated as a policy failure at the city level. Rarely are they examined together as interconnected symptoms of a broader structural shift. But that shift is exactly what defines this moment. America in 2026 is not simply facing economic challenges, it is confronting a deeper question. What happens when the systems designed to provide stability begin to produce instability instead? The silence we're hearing isn't empty. It's loaded with tension, with uncertainty, with the quiet recognition that something fundamental is changing. And the longer that silence persists, the harder it becomes to ignore what it's trying to tell us. If part 1 described the silence, part 2 is about what fills it, a carefully maintained illusion of stability. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. America in 2026 doesn't look like it's breaking. Airports are still crowded. Restaurants are still full on weekends. E-commerce continues to surge. To an outside observer, the system appears functional, even resilient. But what we're seeing is not stability, it's momentum. And momentum can carry something forward long after the underlying structure has weakened. This is the paradox of the modern American economy. It continues to move, even as more individuals feel stuck. Take employment. Official unemployment rates may suggest a relatively healthy labor market, but those numbers conceal a deeper transformation. Job security has quietly eroded. The rise of contract work, freelance arrangements, and short-term roles has redefined what it means to be employed. Many workers are technically employed, yet financially unstable, cycling between gigs, managing inconsistent income streams, and lacking the protections that once came with full-time positions. The result is a workforce that is active but not anchored. And this shift has consequences that extend beyond paychecks. When employment becomes unstable, planning becomes difficult. Long-term decisions, buying a home, starting a family, investing in education, begin to feel risky. Life itself becomes more reactive, less intentional. People aren't necessarily moving forward, they're adapting in real time. At the same time, consumption patterns tell another story, one that seems to contradict this instability. Spending remains high. Credit usage expands. New financial tools make it easier than ever to maintain a certain lifestyle, even when income doesn't fully support it. But this is where the illusion deepens. Much of this consumption is not driven by surplus, it's sustained by leverage. Credit cards, installment plans, and digital financing platforms allow individuals to smooth over financial gaps. In the short term, this creates the appearance of normalcy. In the long term, it builds pressure beneath the surface. It's a system that rewards continuity, keep spending, keep participating, keep the economy moving, but quietly transfers risk onto individuals. And individuals are starting to feel it. There's a growing normalization of financial anxiety that rarely makes headlines. It shows up in smaller ways. People checking their bank accounts more frequently, delaying medical appointments, negotiating rent increases, or taking on side work not for growth, but for survival. These are not isolated behaviors, they are patterns repeated across millions of households. What's striking is how invisible this has become. Unlike past economic crises, there is no single defining event, no dramatic market crash, no immediate, universal shock. Instead, there is a gradual tightening, a slow recalibration of what people consider normal. And because it happens incrementally, it's easier to absorb, harder to resist. But normalization does not equal sustainability. Meanwhile, institutions continue to operate within frameworks that assume a level of stability that no longer exists for many people. Policies are designed around averages. Narratives are built on aggregate data, but averages can obscure extremes. And in 2026, the extremes are expanding. There is a widening gap between how the economy is described and how it is experienced. And that gap matters. Because when people feel that their reality is not reflected in the broader narrative, trust begins to erode. Not just trust in institutions, but trust in the system itself. The sense that effort leads to reward, that planning leads to progress, these are not just economic assumptions, they are cultural foundations. When they weaken, the effects ripple outward. We begin to see changes in behavior. More caution, more skepticism, less long-term commitment. People hedge, diversify, protect themselves in whatever ways they can. And while these responses are rational on an individual level, collectively they signal something deeper, a shift from confidence to contingency. This is what a precarious economy looks like. Not chaos, but uncertainty, not collapse, but constant adjustment. And perhaps the most challenging aspect of this moment is that it doesn't demand immediate action. It doesn't force a clear response. It allows people to continue, to adapt, to endure. But endurance has limits. And as the pressures of layoffs, debt, and housing instability continue to intersect, the question is no longer whether the system can keep moving. It's how long it can do so without fundamentally changing. If instability defines the economic experience, then cities are where it becomes impossible to ignore. For decades, American cities were framed as engines of opportunity, dense, dynamic environments where innovation, culture, and upward mobility converged. But in 2026, many of these same cities are becoming something else. Mirrors. They reflect, in stark and unavoidable ways, the consequences of a system under strain. Because inequality, when it intensifies, does not remain abstract. It becomes spatial. It becomes visible. Walk through any major metropolitan area today, and the contrasts are immediate. Luxury developments rise alongside encampments. High-end retail districts operate within blocks of people living without stable shelter. The proximity is jarring not just economically, but psychologically. It collapses the distance between prosperity and precarity, and that collapse changes how people perceive both. Homelessness, in particular, has shifted from a peripheral issue to a central feature of urban life. It is no longer confined to specific neighborhoods or hidden from public view. It exists in transit systems, under overpasses, along sidewalks, and in public parks. Entire communities are forming in spaces never designed for habitation, communities that are both highly visible and structurally unsupported. What makes this moment distinct is not just the scale, but the persistence. Temporary solutions, shelters, short-term programs, periodic sweeps have struggled to keep pace with the underlying drivers. Rising housing costs, stagnant wages, mental health challenges, and the after-effects of economic shocks all converge here. And when they do, the result is not a temporary crisis, but a sustained condition. Cities, in this sense, are absorbing pressures that originate far beyond their boundaries. Housing markets illustrate this clearly. Over the past decade, affordability has eroded in ways that outpace income growth. Rent increases are not just incremental, they are transformative. For many, staying in the same apartment becomes financially untenable within a single lease cycle. Homeownership, once considered a cornerstone of stability, feels increasingly out of reach for younger generations. And when housing becomes unstable, everything else follows. Employment instability makes it harder to qualify for leases. Debt reduces flexibility. A single disruption, a job loss, a medical expense can trigger a cascade. What was once a stable living situation can unravel quickly, pushing individuals and families into increasingly precarious conditions. This is how the boundary between housed and unhoused begins to blur. It is no longer a fixed line, it is a spectrum, and more people are finding themselves closer to that edge than they expected. At the same time, cities face a growing tension between economic growth and social stability. On one hand, urban centers continue to attract investment, talent, and development. On the other, the benefits of that growth are unevenly distributed. Infrastructure expands, but not always inclusively. Wealth concentrates, while vulnerability spreads. This creates a kind of dual reality, cities that are simultaneously thriving and struggling, and managing that contradiction is becoming increasingly difficult. Public responses often reflect this tension. Policies oscillate between enforcement and assistance, between short-term mitigation and long-term reform. But without addressing the structural roots: housing supply, wage dynamics, access to services, these responses risk becoming cyclical rather than transformative. Meanwhile, public perception is shifting. For those directly affected, the experience is immediate and personal. For others, it is observational but no less impactful. The visibility of hardship changes how people move through their environment. It influences where they go, how they feel, what they expect. Over time, it can alter the social fabric itself, introducing elements of unease, detachment, or even desensitization. And that may be one of the most profound consequences. Because when inequality becomes normalized, when extreme contrasts are seen as routine, it reshapes collective expectations. What once felt unacceptable begins to feel inevitable. And when inevitability takes hold, the urgency to change diminishes. But normalization is not resolution. It is a pause, a temporary accommodation of deeper imbalances. Cities, in 2026, are not just dealing with isolated challenges. They are managing the visible outcomes of interconnected systems, labor markets, financial structures, housing policies, and social services, all intersecting in real time. And as these intersections intensify, the question becomes less about managing symptoms and more about confronting causes. Because the longer these conditions persist, the more they redefine what urban life means and who it is ultimately for. By the time economic strain reaches the level of daily thought, it's no longer just financial, it's psychological. What we're seeing in 2026 isn't just a population dealing with layoffs, rising costs, or housing instability. It's a population adapting internally to a new baseline of uncertainty. And that adaptation, while subtle, may be one of the most important transformations happening beneath the surface. Because debt doesn't just shape what people can afford, it shapes how they think. For many Americans, debt has moved from being a temporary phase to a permanent condition. Student loans stretch into midlife. Credit card balances roll over month to month. Financing options are embedded into nearly every purchase, turning consumption into a series of ongoing commitments rather than discrete decisions. And over time, this creates a shift in mindset. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" people begin asking, "Can I manage the payment?" It's a small linguistic change, but a significant psychological one. It reframes financial decision-making from ownership to maintenance, from capability to endurance. Life becomes less about building and more about balancing. This is where disillusionment begins to take root, not as outrage, but as quiet recalibration. People adjust their expectations downward. Milestones that once felt standard homeownership, financial independence, upward mobility are no longer assumed. They are reconsidered, delayed, or, in some cases, abandoned entirely. And yet, this isn't always visible. Outwardly, many continue to participate in the same systems. They work, spend, socialize, and plan. But internally, there's a growing awareness that the traditional pathways may no longer function as promised. The idea that effort guarantees progress feels less certain. The future becomes harder to model. This uncertainty has a cumulative effect. It influences risk tolerance. People become more cautious, not necessarily because they want to be, but because they feel they have less room for error. Career moves are weighed more heavily. Investments are approached with skepticism. Even personal decisions, relationships, relocations, long-term commitments are filtered through a lens of financial fragility. At the same time, there's a parallel response: overextension. Some individuals, recognizing the instability, choose to lean into the present rather than defer for an uncertain future. If long-term security feels unattainable, short-term experience gains value. This can manifest as continued spending, even in the face of rising debt, not out of ignorance, but as a different kind of calculation. If stability is no longer guaranteed, then immediacy becomes rational. These two responses, caution and overextension, may seem contradictory, but they stem from the same source: diminished confidence in the system's ability to deliver predictable outcomes. And when that confidence erodes at scale, it changes more than individual behavior, it alters culture. We begin to see shifts in how success is defined. Less emphasis on accumulation, more on flexibility. Less focus on long-term planning, more on adaptability. These shifts are not inherently negative, but they signal a departure from the frameworks that previously guided economic life. Meanwhile, institutions continue to operate as if those frameworks still hold. Financial advice still emphasizes long-term investment strategies. Career guidance still assumes linear progression. Policy discussions still reference models built on stability and growth. But for many people, these models feel increasingly disconnected from lived experience. And that disconnect creates friction. It's not always expressed loudly. Often, it appears as disengagement, a quiet withdrawal from systems that no longer feel aligned, lower participation in certain financial behaviors, reduced trust in long-term promises, a sense that the rules exist but the outcomes are less reliable. This is the psychological dimension of systemic strain. It doesn't produce immediate headlines. It doesn't trigger abrupt change, but it accumulates gradually, persistently, until it reaches a point where adaptation is no longer enough. Because while individuals can adjust to a great deal, there are limits to how much uncertainty a system can absorb before it begins to affect not just behavior, but belief. And belief, more than any single metric, is what sustains economic systems over time. When people believe that effort leads somewhere, they invest in careers, in communities, in the future. But when that belief weakens, so does the willingness to commit. And without commitment, even the most resilient systems begin to lose cohesion. By now, the pattern is clear. This isn't a story about a single crisis, it's about convergence. Layoffs, debt, housing instability, and psychological fatigue are not isolated trends. They are interlocking pressures, reinforcing one another in ways that make the system feel increasingly fragile, even when it continues to function on the surface. And that brings us to the question that lingers beneath everything. Is America approaching a breaking point or standing at the edge of a turning point? Because history suggests that systems rarely remain in prolonged states of imbalance without eventually shifting. The only uncertainty is how that shift occurs and who it serves. There are, broadly speaking, two paths forward. The first is continuation. The system absorbs the pressure, adapts incrementally, and maintains its current trajectory. Small reforms are introduced. Narratives adjust. Individuals continue to carry a significant portion of the risk. In this scenario, the visible signs of strain, homelessness, financial insecurity, workforce instability persist, but become further normalized. Life goes on, but under different expectations. The second path is transformation. Not sudden collapse, but structural recalibration. This would require acknowledging that the issues we've explored are not temporary disruptions, but indicators of deeper misalignment. It would mean rethinking how stability is created and distributed across labor markets, housing systems, financial structures, and social policy. But transformation is not automatic. It requires recognition first. And recognition, in a system as large and complex as the United States, is not always immediate. There is inertia, economic, political, cultural. There are competing interests, conflicting narratives, and deeply embedded assumptions about how things are supposed to work, which is why moments like this often feel ambiguous. From one perspective, the system is resilient. It continues to produce growth, innovation, and opportunity. From another, it is increasingly unequal, unpredictable, and strained. Both perspectives can be true at the same time, and that duality makes it harder to define the moment clearly. But ambiguity does not eliminate urgency, because the longer structural tensions persist without meaningful adjustment, the more they shape the trajectory of the future. They influence who has access to stability, who bears risk, and how opportunity is distributed across generations. And perhaps most importantly, they shape perception. If enough people begin to see the system as unreliable, not broken, but inconsistent, then behavior changes. Participation becomes conditional. Trust becomes selective. The social contract, once implicit, becomes negotiable. That is where systems begin to shift, not when they fail outright, but when belief in their reliability begins to erode. So the question is not simply whether America is breaking, it's whether it is willing to confront what is changing. Because the signals are there, subtle, but persistent, in the normalization of financial anxiety, in the visibility of inequality, in the quiet recalibration of expectations, in the growing distance between economic narratives and lived experience. None of these, on their own, define a turning point. But together, they create the conditions for one. And turning points, by their nature, are only clear in retrospect. At the time, they feel like uncertainty, like tension, like something unresolved, which is exactly where America finds itself in 2026. Not collapsed, not stable, but in between. And what happens next will depend less on whether the system can endure and more on whether it can evolve. Because endurance has limits. But evolution, if it happens, changes everything.